Hey guys, today we're going to be taking a look at some code smells in React that will get your pull request denied. So, to get started, let's look at code smell number one. Code smell number one is actually quite simple. It's having components with too many props. As you can see, this bad component right here takes up more than 10 rows, which is a lot. So, you could simplify this by grouping things like title, subtitle, heading, subheading into something like heading or title information. And as you can see, this would also make another step easier, which is looking at the actual component and finding every prop it has. Because if you're not using TypeScript, then you will actually need to go through the whole component to find every occurrence of props dot whatever to actually build this long thing. So as you can see, there are space, readability, and also time advantages to not having too many props. Now let's move on with code smell number two, which is having long components and a lot of repetitions. So again, as you might see, having long components is harder to grasp and harder to understand, so it will take up a lot of time for you to understand the component. And one way you can actually realize that you have a long component is by checking how far to the right your component goes. If you have something like this where a lot of space on your screen is just empty because the component starts this far on the right, you might have a case where you should have created a custom component to put inside of this component. Like this nav element could be turned into a navbar element itself, so something like this basically. Like I've done in this video, by the way, for a mobile navbar. And doing that, you would save a lot of space here, and you would also make it easier to understand your code. Sure, somebody could just put it away in VS Code to kind of understand what it does, but still having a navbar component makes things a lot easier. Also, if you just take a look at this section block right here, which is repeated quite a lot of times, you might come to the idea of also creating a section component which just takes in some text. In this case, that would of course be lorem ipsum. And this way you only had these section elements and not this whole section a lorem ipsum. Because as you can see, here somebody created a section with a div in it and probably forgot to turn these a's into divs again. This is something that could really easily be prevented if you just added a custom component called section, because if you replaced the a with a div there, then it would have been done everywhere. So that's definitely the advantage of using custom components for repetition and also to make your code easier to read. The next thing would be components with too many functions inside of them. Like as you can see, here's a function A, B, C, D, and E. And you could imagine that these functions could be a lot longer if they actually executed any logic and wouldn't just console.log, console.info, etc. So as you can see, there are buttons in this component which execute to functions. So if there only were the buttons, then this would be completely fine, because then it would basically be a functional component that just gives these buttons the functionality they need. But because there's also a form in here and a footer, the component really shouldn't have a conglomeration of both these functions and the JSX. So to prevent that, just again create a custom component for these buttons that contains all of these functions, or have one function that is a bit more complicated but doesn't take up as much space as 5 functions, and make it dependent on the parameter you give them what they would actually do. Like in this case, you could give another parameter called what console statement you want, like log, info, styled log, and that would probably save you some space. But again, those are just cosmetical things. The best thing to do would actually be to put these buttons into their own component with these functions to save some space. Now let's get to code smell number 5, which is mixing up when to use useState and when to use useRef. Because if you remember, useState updates the component whenever the state changes, and useRef doesn't update the component when the value changes. So you might imagine something like this, where you have one button that should update your page when it's clicked and one button that shouldn't. So to fix that, you would just set state in one and set a ref value in the other one. But you might imagine, yeah, that's quite simple. How should I mix it up? Well, if you did, let's just take a look at what would happen. So if you needed to use state and you used ref, then you would probably realize that, because in that case, your site just doesn't update, and yeah, something that doesn't change if it should be easy to grasp. But in the other case, if you should have used use ref and you used use state, you maybe don't even realize it, but your site has unnecessary renders, which might lower your SEO score, or it might make your site less responsive, both of which are, of course, side effects that you wouldn't want. So always keep in mind when to use useState and when to use useRef. So let's get to code smell number 6. Code smell number 6 is not using const when you should actually use it. Because let's look at this. Here we're using const for useState and const for useRef. So that's good. But what if I used let? Because these are values that change, right? So I should use let. You actually shouldn't, because now you could actually do the following, which is override the complete ref element and override the set value method, both of which are things you really wouldn't want to do, because value isn't actually something you should be able to change, but only something the set value method should change. So having that as const is completely fine, quite good actually. And ref is actually an object. And in JavaScript, if you have an object as a constant, only the variable cannot be overwritten, but the parameters of the variable. So basically everything inside the object can be overwritten. So ref is an object that contains current, and current is actually the value. So you can always override current even if the ref is a const, but you can't override the ref with the value 20, which definitely is something you wouldn't want because then it isn't the ref anymore. So just keep in mind, always use const for state and ref. Alright, now let's get to the last and probably worst code smell, which is direct DOM manipulation. As you can see, somebody changed the inner HTML of a component here, which can have really bad side effects with React. One of which might be that your changes will first of all take effect, but as soon as React re-renders because a state change happened, your changes will just be gone again, which of course is something that you really don't want to happen. So to prevent that, always control your components using React or JSX and don't do normal vanilla JavaScript to adjust your components. Sure, sometimes it might work and sometimes it might even be necessary, but in this case you really should take care of it and don't change your components using inner HTML. So I hope that you won't do these code smells and that your pull requests will always get approved first try. And let me know if some of these happen to you during PRs.